Right. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We're going to be talking to you about how to turn old sheds or space you've got on farm into protein factories using insects. And it's a joint talk between Betabugs and Flybox. Betabugs is just there, Flybox is there, behind you. And Betabugs is an insect genetics company. So you can think of us as a bit of an avigen or a genus PIC for bugs. So we improve the bugs by selective breeding, and then we also supply them from a hatchery or multiplier farm just outside of Edinburgh. And we supply the livestock in the form of eggs or baby larvae, juvenile larvae, and we'll be focusing on the juvenile larvae product in the context of these systems. And I'll just pass on to Larry to introduce in terms of Flybox.
Hey guys, so yeah, I'm the other part of this duet. I'm Larry Koch, I'm the founder of Flybox. So we specialize on the hardware side, so that's the climate-controlled units that actually grow the larvae into maturity, as well as the automation of farms from small to large, how you can get the labor down of actually running an insect farm. We also support, so it's not just the tech itself, but the outputs, where does that go, the inputs. This is Thomas's area, and also the feedstock. So what are you actually feeding insects? So we're going to go into all of those in some detail, but that's us.
Yeah. So what we'll be sharing with you today is how you can be diversifying into insect farming, and how it is accessible, financially viable, because that's important. You need to make the money and make the financials work, and then how it also builds in from the sustainability proposition as well, and why we're seeing an uptake in insect protein. And based on what we did yesterday in terms of talk, I think we should have a good amount of time for questions from yourselves as well, so we can dig into things.
So this is basically the visual of what we're going to go through today. So we'll take like a 30,000 foot view. We're talking about agricultural space. That's agricultural barns, old poultry sheds. It can also just be land. We're talking about setting up a modular insect farm. That's a pre-made, if you like, pre-installed protein factory, so alternative protein factory using reject organics or byproduct. There's simple operation. That's kind of like many of the veteran farmers in this room would not be shy to. There's juvenile larvae, which are the thing that we're farming here. There's the feedstock, and when we say feedstock, we're not just we're dealing with an animal that can thrive on much more rudimentary feed than other livestock. So we want to be using reject organics much more here than we might for other industries. And then there's the buying back of the product. So at the end of that, the fattened larvae, what industries, what sectors do they go into? And we arrange that as well. So this is kind of, if you like, a system where we've tried to uncomplicate the insect farming process and business, and also provide everything to set people up for success. And so while we're going to pitch you this as an idea, as a concept to get people thinking, there is, of course, many people in the room that have their own ideas, their own arbitrages with their existing companies, feedstocks they have access to, products they want to incorporate, their own supply chains they want these things to potentially go into. And of course, this can be flexed to those needs, but this is to give you a full picture of like a kind of done-for-you system. Yeah.
Yeah. And to kick things off, first we'll just talk a bit about the black soldier fly, and just give you an overview of how that works, and then we'll dig into the systems. So black soldier fly, as Larry's mentioning, you can grow them on co-products, food surplus, food wastes, and other materials. And that's basically your insect farming going on. And then you can put them into, the protein can be put into animal and aqua feed. And then it can be used to feed fish, pigs, chickens, and pets. So that's your livestock producers. And then that's going to end up on the shelves. Well, not the pets. And the virtuous cycle there is you actually got food surplus or materials coming off of each piece of the supply chain. And you can be putting them back into the insect farming. And we'll talk about that towards the end as well, in terms of sustainability. The next slide, so this slide shows you picture in terms of life cycle, so a linear life cycle, where we have a fly, which is quite big. That's the black soldier fly. They basically just exist to mate and lay eggs. The eggs, a single female will lay around 700 eggs in a go, and then each egg will hatch out to give you a very small what we call a neonate. We don't have those pictured here, but they grow out after 5 days into juvenile larvae. and then the juvenile larvae grow rapidly into larvae once you start feeding them. And they'll go into a pre-pupa and a pupa after. You don't really want to be going into that stage. You're just using the larva as the protein source. That's when it becomes a protein. Pre-pupa, pupae, they're turning into flies. You can see they're going brown, dark there, and that's basically building up chitin in the exoskeleton, which if they've got too much of, and you try putting that into the diet, it can become an anti-nutritional, actually. And a few points about this is, well, you've seen from the picture, they're hungry and fast growing. So I like to think about it as a rabbit turning into an elephant in 2 weeks, as that kind of equivalent increase in body mass. And they're omnivorous. They'll eat a wide range of materials. You can put them on fruit and veg. You can put them on meats. You can even, not in the UK, but in other places, they can be grown on manures as well. So they're very versatile. They will process a wide range of things. Performance may vary because it is an animal. It's nutrition. Nutrition will drive the performance and the final result you get. But typically, they're high in protein, 40 to 50%, once you've dried them out and turn them into a meal. And it's a low-carbon alternative because you're producing them locally, so there's reduced greenhouse gas compared to bringing them in. Also from the perspective of producing the other proteins. It's low risk as well in terms of you can farm them legally in the UK. There's no disease associated with black soldier fly as well. And the flies, in the case of the flies and the larvae, they don't really transmit stuff either. And when it comes to farming them, it's a way of turning waste into value. As we mentioned, there's a protein with a low carbon footprint. You can use them for on-farm feeding. You can feed live right now. And if you're just using them to supplement, there's a whole well-being and diet, well-being play. But you can also be using it to start replacing soya in the diet and other proteins. And it's also an opportunity to diversify on farm. So you can be selling, as Larry mentioned, you could be selling the protein into other industries. So it's a way of diversifying your farming operations. And lastly, the bugs themselves, they produce a manure like other animals, and that's what we call frass. And that's actually a valid fertilizer. It's nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and it will also have a range of benefits. We're seeing some of the research come out now where it does benefit plants in terms of helping bolster their plant health as well, due to other compounds in there. And now I'll just talk about how juvenile larvae supply works in the context of the system. So this is one of your key inputs, as we've highlighted here. And we do two products. We do juvenile larvae and eggs, but we'll just talk about why using juvenile larvae, especially in the context of a modular on-farm system. It simplifies your rearing. You're just receiving juveniles which are ready to go, and you put them straight into the feed. It allows you to not worry about any of the breeding steps. You're not thinking about making eggs and getting flies to mate and all this sort of stuff, which is actually quite technical. And if that's fluxing on you, if it's changing, you're not going to be able to get a stable production of larvae out, and that's just going to make it very hard to sell stuff as well. So in this way, you effectively dedicate all your production footprint and labor to just producing. And you can reduce your cycle time significantly versus eggs, because you don't need to hatch them out. You don't need to grow eggs into juveniles and then grow them out. You just have juveniles which you turn into finished larvae. And that takes your cycle time down to 7 days. So you're getting more out of your asset over time. And as we mentioned before, you don't need to worry about hatch rates in terms of converting eggs. So how does it work? We hatch the eggs out at our hatchery. We'll feed the baby larvae till they grow into juveniles, and that makes sure they've had a great start. We'll clean, package, and then ship them to you overnight. And then, as you can see in the picture, you basically tip the juveniles into trays, into your prepared feed, put them into a grow-out unit, leave them there for a week, and then you harvest them. And then you receive your next batch of juveniles, and you do it again. So this allows you to effectively have a very batch process within each unit, and then you can have, say, 3 units running on a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and producing protein on the regular. And I'll pass on to Larry in terms of feedstock and how it actually works. Yep, there you go.
Cool, thanks Thomas. So we're now going to get into the feedstock, because we've spoken about the juvenile larvae. So this is the feed that they would actually eat. So that's this part of the diagram. So that's really the other key input that's coming in. In general, larvae have very small mouths, so what you want is a small particle size for the feedstock. You also want it moist, so unlike other livestock, they live in their feed. So not only are you looking at the nutritional characteristics of the feed, like any other animal, they have their ideal protein, carbs, fat, all these things. You also have to worry about things like viscosity of the feed, some of the thermal properties of the feed, so that they can eat efficiently. So what you want, these insects will eat anything. If you put them into a dustbin with fruit and veg waste or consumer waste, they will of course eat it. The question is, will they eat it economically? And so to get BSF operations economical, you want them to be able to eat as fast as possible and turn into that elephant from that rabbit as quickly as possible. So the higher the protein, like any other diet, favored. You want them from a consistent source because, of course, if you are constantly changing your feedstock, you are changing your product properties. And so depending on the market that it's being sold into, there's different tolerances for that. So for instance, wild bird food, they care more about the appearance of the product, whereas aquafeed, extremely precision based, and you're going to need some scale and a lot of consistency to sell into that market. So in terms of the substrates as well, you're limited by what's permitted, which I'll kind of get into a second. We, as kind of Flybox and Better Bugs, we have access to feedstock from multiple large food processors, stable feedstock with high protein. We're going to get into the reasons why they would want it to go to insects as opposed to other waste treatment solutions. There's actually some really interesting drivers behind that in terms of how this method is classed from a reporting point of view rather than something like anaerobic digestion or recycling. So there's plenty of it out there. They want people to be using it. So currently, that is you're limited to kind of established kind of byproducts that are pre-consumer. So think brewers' grains, dairy byproducts, vegetable byproducts, and bakery byproducts. By the time we get to June of 2025, there is a consultation that's gone out at the moment where you will be able to, most likely, according to what's been tabled, there'll be more processed animal proteins and ABPs will be included into this list. And that is obviously the direction of travel if we want to deal with or reuse organic waste that the food system produces. We need to be able to actually let nature, or these insects that do this in nature, have access to it. We're not talking about feeding these to any animal. We're talking about feeding this material to decomposers who are antimicrobial in nature. In terms of the tech then, the farming system, so we've got the juvenile larvae come in, the feedstock coming in. I'll explain how that all kind of happens with the technology. So the two main building bricks, and again, here I'm just showing this is a 5 ton a day system, 5 ton a day of organics. This is just an arbitrary number that I'm just showing. So each of those yellow ones are grow modules. And so there's 5 of those. Monday to Friday is the kind of operation. Which I know farmers love because 7 days is the usual working week. So I've given you 2 days off there. That's five grow boxes. The feedstock kitchen is where the organics are actually processed. So I'll go into those in a second. And there's other bits and pieces, but those are the 2 main ones to think about. So I should have probably had a blown up image of this, but essentially the organics go into the red one, where it's then blended into that consistency, that porridge, and then it's automatically dosed into trays. So you have an automated doser that will do 10 or 25 kilo doses, depending on the trays we use. It's then put onto a pallet by the system. That's then picked up by a forklift. It's put into its growing area. The doors are closed once an entire grow area is filled. And you wait 7 to 8 days, and the climate control system takes care of everything. And out comes at the end of the process, you're left with the black soldier fly that are mature, that have eaten all their food, and the frass, the manure is left over. Those then get sieved, and the live larvae, in this case, in this example, are stored and frozen, and they are then collected by an off-taker once the batch is big enough. And then you have the frass, which is also separated. So there's a separation stage at the end. And so that's basically rinse and repeat. Each day there's a destacking of one growing chamber and a restacking of the next chamber. In terms of our tech, we've been very careful to start our IP around the climate control. So unlike poultry and pigs, we're talking about vertical farming here. So these animals are in trays stacked vertically. You want to keep, you're then putting those into growing chambers. It's very difficult to distribute the air inside one of these chambers effectively when you have that level of obstructions. The larvae are giving off a tremendous amount of heat. There's a lot of metabolic activity going on. That's why they're able to grow so fast. Getting rid of that heat uniformly is a challenge for many BSF companies. So that's what we spent 3 years in R&D doing, is how you actually do that so that you then don't have to touch that system. And the other side is on the automation. We have very large factories that have been built across Europe. They're fully automated. Obviously, for a smaller system, that doesn't make sense. The capex doesn't make sense to invest in that sort of stuff at certain scales. So we've worked out the kind of nice balance between automation and simple and simplicity. So we like to say, we try to get to 75% of the automation, but for half the cost. And so that's kind of where we cut our teeth. So before you ask, the way we like to see things is a lot of the existing food industry is looking at this space and they were thinking this is too expensive and really complicated. What we're trying to do here with the support systems that plug into this is make it much easier, an existing support network to plug into, and to have it much lower capex and to be able to build up unit by unit rather than having to commit to a 10 million pound factory and take on the entire execution risk of an insect farm. So we think this kind of model plugs into the existing food system much better by letting everyone do what they're naturally good at. And we stick to the tech and the insects, and then everyone else can stick to the actual operating, and then the buyers are happy with what they're receiving to make their products.
It's worth pointing out as well, Larry, it takes much longer to build one of the big ones. How long does it take with yourselves?
It's 3 to 6 months is how long we need, depending on the size, to get a site built.
Yeah, much faster. Those can take 2-3 years to build, like the big ones.
Yeah. And in terms of the day in the life, so that's the operation side, we're talking about, it's not a perfect conversion, but you're talking about one full-time employee per 2.5 tons per day. So the example I showed you before would be about 2 people to run and supervise that system. And so, I don't think I highlighted it, but a 5-ton-a-day system will yield about a ton a day of live larvae, and we'll get into the kind of financials later. And so you need about 2 people to supervise that. As you go up, it doesn't quite scale. You actually need less people, per extra ton you add beyond that point. But that's roughly how to think about it. And in terms of the step-by-step, so you've got the feed that needs to be processed in the mixer, that needs to be switched on, and the waste is dosed. So it's auto-dosed into the feeding trays. The juvenile larvae come in a preset amount, so that the amount of waste in that tray is matched to the amount of juveniles, because you don't want to have too few larvae that they don't actually then consume their waste and they're left wet. Then, as you were saying yesterday, they can't be sieved. They're too wet. Once they've finished eating, they're not interested, and then good luck sieving them. And so you want that dose to be perfectly matched to the waste, so it's as economical as possible. Once those doses, they're stacked in a pallet, they're forklift over to the growing area, they're then destacked in the separation stage. The products can then be processed. In the case I showed you, it's literally just frozen to kill, washed and frozen to kill, and then there's a kind of washing of the trays and a repeating of that process. So in terms of the products, at the end of this process, we've got the fattened larvae and the frass that have been separated at its most simple. You can, of course, decide to add a drying stage in and actually dry the larvae, grind the larvae into powders. You can even turn the live larvae into puree. You can defat the larvae to extract the oils and create a defatted protein. There are many options. We've tried to keep it simple here, but of course, come and chat to us later if you are interested in any of those things. But in terms of the feed markets for these kind of systems, I mentioned 5 tons of feedstock going in is about a ton of live larvae coming out and 1.5 tons of frass fertilizer coming out. So that's kind of, if you times that by 30, you get an idea of what these things produce. And so the feed markets that you would go after, like most insect protein is going to the dog and pet food market. Insects have very interesting functional properties. They're like hypoallergenic. They transfer a lot of antibacterial, antimicrobial properties into the feed itself. So there's like a kind of independent reason why pet food really like that, and we all care a lot about our dogs. They'll pay premiums for things, and so that's actually one of the most attractive markets. If you can prep your operation to slot into that supply chain, very good. But there's also specialty fishing, bait companies. Wild bird food is a huge market. I mean, reptiles, exotic pets, and wild bird foods are like 300 million pounds is spent on that stuff a year. So these are not insignificant markets. And this is a range. This is from people in our network and what they will offer for live larvae. That's the kind of range we're talking, 700 to 1,200 a ton. Then in terms of the FRAS markets, that's all the usual people that are looking at making peat-free, chemical-free fertilizers. There's lots of people who are experimenting with FRAS, putting it in with biochar. There's many different recipes coming out to try and replace reliance on chemical fertilizers, and that's a kind of range that we're seeing in the market at the moment. There's a pasteurized product that you can make as well. You can pelletize FRAS to reduce it, to make transport easier. So there's a few other bits that we're not mentioning here, but that's just the general what you're looking at. And then if I press next, this is just to show some happy customers who are eating the live larvae. I mean, this is just to show you that animals go for it. If you do end up wanting to incorporate these things into your own supply chain, if you're going to do that, you're going to need your buyer to be compensating you for the extra expense of doing this, and it is an extra expense because right now in the UK it can only be fed as an enrichment feed. But there are many people we've been speaking to even here that have that kind of relationship. So at small inclusion rates, that is an option for some people. In terms of the larvae product benefits, I already mentioned as a protein it's hypoallergenic. It's got a balanced amino acid profile. It's an animal protein. It's not a plant protein. So it's essentially upcycling plant proteins into animal proteins. It's highly palatable for poultry. Got lots of lauric acid, omega fatty acids. They're actually called calci worms if you look them up online, colloquially, because they're just very full of calcium and phosphorus, which is good for all sorts of animals. And yeah, they're natural probiotic is what I was talking about before. And in terms of well-being for pecking animals, there's also that aspect. FRAS, has about kind of a 232. NPK. It depends on what your substrate is really, but it's seen as a very good at increasing plant yield. It's obviously a natural alternative because the insects have shed some of their skins as they've been eating. That's left in the FRAS, and this actually causes a kind of immune response in a positive sense for crops because they believe that there's insects around when there aren't. So they do all sort of epigenetic good things, and so lots of really interesting microorganisms and a kind of microorganism ecosystem in FRAS, and it's really odor-free and dry. You can come see some up there and some there later. It's like soil. It doesn't smell. It can store. So you've taken wet organics and just dried it in 7 days. So in terms of the financials, so this is again 5 ton a day system just selling live larvae. So we can go through it line by line. If you can't see, please kind of let me know. I'll try and kind of call it out. So there's the seedling cost, and that's the cost of actually getting the juvenile larvae, paying for them and delivered. You've then got utilities and labor, which is the energy of running the processing machines in our case, and also the growing chambers, as well as the labor behind that, a 5 ton day system. Then you've got the feedstock cost. That's the logistics of getting the reject material to your site. And then we just made some assumptions for rent. There's obviously assumptions in this. Then you've got a certain output that will yield. And then based on the pricing I gave you before, that has a certain income associated with that. And then you have a net income. So we don't think, when we're speaking to people who are thinking about building new sites, there's a lot of on-paper work you do before you push go on any project, as anyone would. There's no point in getting into this unless there's a very clear route and all of the contracts are already in place to achieve at least a 5-year payback. Otherwise, why would you put your money into something unless you can do that? Unless you have other reasons, other opportunity costs, other things you're trying to arbitrage for your own, another business that you're doing. There's other benefits you're capturing that might not be completely financial. But other than that, we like to just make sure that at least you're able to hit this if you're going to diversify into this space. And so again, depending on where exactly in the country you're located, there's different providers of ours who will have different costs of getting the feedstock to you. The seedlings, depending on the scale you're going at, they go down in price with scale. So there's this is a 5 ton a day system. it's kind of like in each case this has to be reviewed and updated with the specific site case in mind. If you want to use your own feedstock, if you have a sister company or a partner farm near you that has fruit and veg in abundance that they want to put into this, that can be incorporated into the diet. We have a nutritionist in-house that will fold that in with our other sources so that you can use as much of that as possible. So there are opportunities and flexibilities here. Yeah, and I think I'll hold back to you for the sustainability side.
Yeah, and I'll give a context as to, so the financials always have to work. So you need to, otherwise it's not going to be a viable proposition. But then there's the sustainability angle on top, which gives it an extra edge, I would say. And this is really about how it's low carbon and sustainability. So soya is effectively made by, well, we need to increase the amount of land for soya, so we chop down the Amazon and other forests, and then it gets shipped in. So there's always a greenhouse gas emission associated with a change in land use, change in the land, and also bringing it in. And when you look at the numbers, if you use insect protein, you can reduce, significant amounts of soy footprint, 500,000 tons by 2050. Now, I think that number is probably a bit far out. They were quite conservative when they did that report, and I think it could be earlier than that. But what we need to do is have the industry scale up. The other angle to this is you've got the food waste as well, which, depending on how you process it, can be producing greenhouse gases. By feeding it to the larvae and then turning it into a meal, you're also generating CO2 savings. When we put this all on a graph, you can kind of see how insect farming, which is the bit which says BITS BSF, is in the top right. So it's effectively avoiding CO2, but also being a profitable operation. And we'll walk through the rest. So landfill, low profitability, but anything you put into landfill will just decompose and produce carbon dioxide. Composting also produces some gas, but takes less. So there's a bit more of a saving there. Incineration kind of sits there, better energy recovery, better profitability. But again, not great on the carbon dioxide front. Anaerobic digestion sits in a similar space to black soldier fly and to insect farming. But what we're now seeing is, and I'll move to the next slide to illustrate this, what we're now seeing is even the food waste processing companies and even the retailers are seeing insect farming as a viable alternative to anaerobic digestion. And the reason for that is we have a food waste hierarchy. And a food waste hierarchy says, first if we've got any food waste or surplus, we should give it to people. And it goes to, if it's a retailer, they'll give it to colleagues or they'll give it to charity, so it gets fed to people. Then, if there's stuff which can't be fed to people, it goes to animals. Your cakes and your breads might go into dairy, but then there's stuff like fruit and veg and wet food which can't easily be put into animals. That typically goes into anaerobic digestion. Conveniently, insects are also animals, so you're now taking things out of what would be considered wasting them, from an anaerobic digestion perspective, and putting them back into animals so you can get that nutrient back into the supply chain rather than turning it into energy. So this is where the retailers and food waste companies are seeing this as a new opportunity for them to be moving into, and why insect protein is picking up. To give you a context, if you go to Denmark, there's a very big insect farm which has been built, and it's partly supplied by Arla's dairy, whatever is left from their dairy process. And Arla was putting that into biogas and is now diverting into insect farming on the basis of it's higher up in the food waste hierarchy. We're feeding it to animals, not feeding it to bacteria. So, putting it all together, we've walked you through the model. And so what are the advantages of it? It's a simpler and more efficient model. It's a system which is very space effective. You can effectively scale it up in a plug-and-play format. It's a stable system because you don't need to focus on producing your own eggs or juveniles. You receive them in. And that means your production is going to be stable, and that means your financials are going to be stable. And in doing so, you can solely focus on producing. You don't need to worry about the egg production part at all, and you can just focus on the key metrics associated with production. Makes your life simpler, less variables to track. And then why work with this team? Effectively, we've got our dedicated and local suppliers. As Larry mentioned, we can have you up and running in 3 to 6 months, depending on the scale of your operation. It's a rapid turnaround in terms of supply as well. We're with you from the start, So we'll provide you with the advice and the know-how to get you up and running. We understand insect farming can seem very novel. It's not that hard once you get into it. It's usually dipping your toe into the water is the hardest bit. And then moving in, you start scaling up and it becomes an actual farming operation. And because we're with you from the start and we also want to see this industry succeed, we're invested in your success because we want to see you succeed. So we're going to set you up for success. And this is why we've got this package, and effectively, which will also adapt around you, it's to simplify your operation. And lastly, you're working with experts in the field who've spent time doing this, so it means you can do it faster. Because if you were to try doing it yourselves and going into R&D, it's not worth the hassle anymore. You can just bring the systems online and start producing, start making the money, and contributing to our industry as well. So, to recap, you can take space, slot in a modular insect farm. I think it's worth noting that if you don't want the boxes themselves, Larry's very flexible around that.
Yeah, that's right. If it's an agricultural building rather than land, the boxes is just to show very simply the 5-step days, but this will be done in insulated rooms rather than in containers. There's no need to pay for that part of it. So yeah.
And then you've got the operation, so you're putting the labor in, typical farming operation. You receive the juveniles on a weekly basis. Well, if you've got 5, you'll be receiving a batch every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, weekly. And then you're putting your feedstocks in as well. And then lastly, you've got the offtake, which enables you to generate the revenue off it. And we're just behind you, 10431. Flybox is just there. And happy to have any questions on the field here in the talk, or we can have questions at our stand as well. Thank you, and thank you for your attention, time, and engaging with us.
Thanks. I think we actually have like nearly 20 minutes of, no, 12 minutes, I think, of
We've got time for Q&A. We've got plenty of time for Q&A.
Yes.
1 second, I'll get you the mic so everyone can hear you. I think you're just talking to it.
Hello. What sort of cost is it to set up a 5-ton?
So capex wise, it's about 750,000, depending on the bits and pieces, the detail. But that's the rough amount. We are very close to securing a kind of agreement with an asset finance company. But yeah, so that option might come around, and we want to, by the end of the year, be able to offer a rental model. And I should also say that because they're modular, there is an option of always just doing a single, container, just a single grow container. It is more labor intensive to start with, so not as economical, but in terms of getting used to the system, that's kind of where we want to get to. What you can also think of it from that point of view. Yeah. So
you can step it. You can start with one system and then keep building up as you build up the confidence and build up the offtake as well.
Yeah, but with that waste processing unit there is 200 of that cost. So really to make sure that you're getting the right payback, you'd want to be doing 5 tons plus before you start bringing in the automated feed dosing. So that's the idea there. Yeah.
And what sort of markets have you got already?
So we've got several in pet food, and also specialty aqua feeds. So this is like live fishing baits, different fishing baits for the angling community that are kind of specialty made. Yeah. In terms of the FRAS, horticulture and garden center one. Yeah.
It's worth noting as well, if you go into the scale of operation and you push it up a bit further, you'd probably be one of the larger UK producers at the moment in terms of scale. So you'd be able to, especially if you went into a bit more of processing, you might be able to also start supplying into the feed companies, coming in on a premium basis in terms of some sort of premium product. And there would be a level of interest in this. I think what we're also seeing is even the retailers and the kind of like the associated suppliers are starting to think about sustainable products marketed from a sustainable perspective. And so this will give you an angle into that as well.
There was quite a difference between the top price you were getting for your product and the bottom price. The top price was going into what?
So the top price was actually going to one of the people I mentioned. We do have another buyer that's actually another insect farmer in the UK that is then processing it and capturing essentially capturing the margin somewhat. So if you like, it's a kind of fallback price the way we like to see it to people. Like we can't make the guarantee ourselves, but with that person, it's one of the first people we connect people with to at least get that lower bound in, if that makes sense. Yeah.
And what chance do you think there is of getting legislation through the government to be able to feed it into poultry feed and things like that?
So I think so. We should see that happening, I'd say, later next year. The minister was pretty aware of it in terms of managed to grab him yesterday. If it is going through consultation, it's being pushed through gradually, and it's not rocket science from a legislation perspective. Being very upfront, the EU's gone ahead and done it. They've done all the risk assessments as well. So it's a case of really just picking up that legislation and transferring it into the UK legislation. And then I think the bit where the UK stands has an advantage is we could go a bit faster on broadening feedstocks. And that means we can start using things which have meat in them and animal byproducts and possibly post-consumer waste as well. So things like from canteens. And I saw everyone taking photos of that slide with the numbers. There's a report. So if you've got the photo, you'll find the report name. And if you Google that, I think it's Frontier Economics did it with Impatient Capital, and they basically developed a report on how the price of insect protein could come down if these regulations are relaxed. And you can actually, in theory, start getting quite close to soy price as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Just on the modules, when you load and unload them, is that all by hand?
So in the 5-ton one, inside those grow boxes is a kind of rail system. So that where the pallet is stacked from the waste stacking machine, that's picked up by a forklift and it's dropped at the front of the container, and there's a winch that takes it to the back in that system. But if you're going with one box and you're not going for full automation to start with, you can do it manually. There is that option. There's a kind of platform with wheels option that can take some of the labor out, but yeah, the auto loader is a bit more expensive, but
when we say manual, Larry, that's still you're palletizing these things, and
yeah,
you're pulling them out with a forklift or some sort of pallet handler.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right, thank you.
2 minutes. I think we've got time for 1 to 2 more questions.
Sorry, is it UK only?
So in terms of the ecosystem, it's UK only, but we're actively quoting for and will be hopefully building in France and Belgium later this year. Yeah, potentially pretty soon, but it's in terms of they're already established insect companies, so they already have the feedstock figured out. They didn't need that support; they just want the hardware. But yeah, what we've been suggesting here is the ecosystem in the UK. But there are companies that are thinking like this in Europe as well. Yeah, so everyone's realizing that the ecosystem is what's lacking, and most livestock, there's willing buyers all around. There's feed companies, integrator models everywhere. And the insect industry has been venture capital financed. All the infrastructure has been financed by venture capital, and now so we came together and started thinking we want a system that works with the food system and works like the food system, and that meant yes, we want to sell hardware, but we actually have to become a market maker as well. And so we put significant resources into connecting the dots for people, but we can only do that one country at a time, unfortunately. Yeah.
Yeah, one more question. Harborough, yeah.
Hi, James from Harborough. Do you get any like smells? Say if you had one of these put up next to you, would you get any complaints from the locals or environmental kind of?
There's a degree of depending on how you run your process, you can get some odor. It's typically ammonia. Larry can talk a bit more about the handling of that, though.
Yeah, that 5-ton-a-day system has a carbon filter attached to it. Yeah. So there's also like a really high-end UV one. If you've got sensitive neighbors, you're very, very close. There's different options, but one single box, to give you an idea, is under the thresholds when it comes to ammonia emissions and things. But as soon as you get to 5, you have to run the exhaust through treatment for odor. Yeah.
So if your neighbour puts something up, you might get some complaints.
Yeah, if you're very kind of close to people, yes. But it's the sort of normal thing. It's the same similar smell that you'd get in a poultry shed. You know, they're very similar. Livestock eating, yeah.
I think we're gonna wrap at this point.
Thank you.
But if there's any other questions, stands are literally just behind you, and happy to continue conversations there. Thank you.
Thank you.